Ezra Doyle was kneeling in the dirt behind the livery, scrubbing blood off a saddle that wasn't his, when 6 Apache riders came down the ridge road like the sky itself had cracked open. The town of Widow's Bend froze mid-motion, a woman's basket of eggs slipping from her hands, a shopkeeper's broom stopping in the air. At the front rode Chief Tosca, spine straight as a rifle barrel, his eyes fixed on nothing but Ezra. He did not slow his horse until its breath was hot on Ezra's shoulder. Chief Tosca dismounted without a word, and the crowd that had gathered, 20, then 30 people, went silent enough to hear the wind moving through Thol the mesquite. Ezra could feel every pair of eyes shifting from the chief to him and back again, waiting for some explanation he didn't have. He walked straight to Ezra, close enough that Ezra could see the old grief carved into the man's face, and he spoke 4 words no one in that town would ever forget. "My son chose you." Ezra opened his mouth, but nothing came. He knew no son. He had shaken no Apache man's hand, broken no bread at their fire, not that anyone in Widow's Bend had ever seen. The rancher he worked for, Otis Grum, stepped forward with his hand near his belt, demanding an explanation the chief would not give him. Chief Tosca did not even look at Grum. His eyes stayed on Ezra, waiting, as if the truth were a door only Ezra could open. "Whose son?" Ezra finally managed, his voice cracking like dry leather. Chief Tosca reached into the fold of his blanket and drew out a small carved wooden horse, no bigger than a thumb, its edges worn smooth from years of handling. He pressed it into Ezra's palm and closed the young man's fingers around it himself. "You do not remember him by name," the chief said, "but he remembers you by everything you did," the crowd murmured. Ezra stared at the little wooden horse as though it might speak the answer itself. Somewhere behind that carving was a memory buried so deep he'd stopped believing it was real. A boy in the flood water, a hand gripping his wrist, a name he'd never learned. Chief Tosca turned back to his horse, and before he mounted, he said the words that would unravel everything Widow's Bend thought it knew about the drifter who mucked stalls for 30 cents a day. "Tomorrow, I tell you who you buried without knowing it." Ezra stood in the empty street long after the dust from the chief's departure had settled, the little wooden horse pressed so hard into his palm, it left a mark. 30 people had watched a stranger call him son to a dead man, and not one of them, not even Grum, had asked the question that mattered most. Not who Nachi was, but why a boy Ezra had never properly met would spend his last strength making certain trouble never reached Ezra's door. That question followed him home like a second shadow. The town did not let him breathe easy that night. By the time Ezra reached the bunkhouse, the story had already grown 3 sizes larger than the truth, passed hand to hand across porches and fence posts, that the drifter had a secret Apache wife somewhere in the hills, that he'd stolen something from the tribe, that the chief had ridden in to collect a debt in blood. None of it was true, and none of it mattered, because in Widow's Bend, a rumor only needed a face to land on, and tonight, that face was his. Otis Grum found him before the rooster did, boots already dusty from pacing the yard. He wanted names, dates, proof that Ezra hadn't been sneaking onto tribal land, or worse. And when Ezra had none of those things to give, only a wooden horse and a memory he barely trusted himself, Grum's face twisted into the look of a man deciding whether an employee had become a liability. "Whatever this is," Grum said, low and hard, "you end it before it costs me my herd." Ezra said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence cost less than the truth did, even when the truth was the only thing he owned. Ezra hadn't slept in a bed he owned since he was 11, when a fever took both his parents in the same week and left him to the mercy of whichever ranch would feed him for work. He remembered the coffin lids being nailed shut in the same afternoon. No time even given for proper grief, because the neighbors who'd come to help had their own herds waiting on them. He'd learned early that softness got you nothing in this country. Not sympathy, not shelter, not a second bowl of stew. So he'd built himself into a quiet, careful man, the kind who spoke only when spoken to and flinched at nothing. Because flinching was a thing that got noticed, and being noticed had never once gone well for him. That night, memory came for him anyway. 3 winters back, a flash flood had ripped through the canyon trail while Ezra was hauling fence posts alone, and the current had dragged him under before he understood what was happening. He remembered cold water filling his lungs, the world spinning brown and roaring, and then a hand, strong and sure, closing around his wrist and hauling him onto a rock ledge like he weighed nothing at all. He remembered too the moment after, lying on the rock ledge, coughing up canyon water, staring up at a face maybe 2 or 3 years older than his own. Dark eyes calm in a way that made the whole roaring world feel briefly survivable. The young man hadn't asked if Ezra was hurt, or where he belonged, or whose ranch he rode for. He'd simply hauled him further from the water's edge and started gathering dry brush, as though saving a stranger's life were no more remarkable than starting a fire. The young Apache man who'd pulled him out never gave a name. He'd simply built a small fire, wrapped Ezra in a dry blanket, and sat across from him until dawn, saying almost nothing except one line Ezra had carried in his chest ever since, without knowing why it mattered. A man is not measured by what he owns. He is measured by what he carries for someone else. Then at first light, the stranger had vanished back into the hills, and Ezra had told no one, certain that if he spoke of it, the town would twist it into something ugly. In the 3 years since, Ezra had ridden past the mouth of that canyon 100 times on ranch business, and every single time, without ever telling another living soul, he'd slowed his horse and looked toward the hills where the stranger had disappeared, half hoping to catch some sign the man was still out there. He never did. He'd told himself eventually that the debt would simply live unpaid in his chest forever. One more thing he'd have to carry alone, the way he carried everything else. He had carried that wooden feeling of debt for 3 years, without a face to put to it, without even a name. He'd told himself it was a stranger passing through, nothing more, until this afternoon, when an old chief rode into town and called him son to a boy he'd never officially met. Ezra turned the small carved horse over and over in his hands by lamplight, searching for a crack in the wood that might hold an answer, and found only smoothness worn by years of another man's thumb. He'd never told a soul about the flood, not because he was ashamed of being saved, but because the moment had felt too fragile to survive being spoken aloud in a town like Widow's Bend, where kindness was often mistaken for weakness, and weakness was something men remembered about you for years. So he'd folded the memory small, like a letter meant only for himself, and carried it quietly through branding season and blizzard and every ordinary Tuesday since, never once expecting it to come looking for him again. Widow's Bend had never made room for a boy with no family name attached to him. He'd grown up passed between 3 different ranches, each one keeping him only as long as he was useful and letting him go the moment a stronger hand showed up looking for work. He'd learned to eat fast, speak little, and never let anyone see him want something, because wanting was a door people liked to slam shut in front of an orphan just to watch his face when it happened. So when the stranger by the flood fire had spoken to him plainly, without pity and without conditions, something in Ezra had cracked open that he didn't have words for. He hadn't asked the man's name because he'd been too afraid that naming it would make it real, and real things could be taken away. It was easier, safer, to let the memory stay a ghost, until an old chief rode into town and gave the ghost a face, a father, and a grave Ezra had never known to visit. By morning, half of Widow's Bend had already decided what the scene meant, and none of their guesses were kind. Otis Grum cornered Ezra at the corral fence before breakfast, jabbing a thick finger into his chest, warning him that no ranch hand of his was going to bring Apache business into town and put a target on Grum's cattle. He reminded Ezra, unnecessarily, of every meal and every dry bunk he'd been given these past 2 winters, as if kindness bought in advance could be called in like a debt whenever it suited him. "You go near them again," Grum said, "and you can find your 30 cents someplace else." Ezra said nothing back, only nodded the way he always did when survival meant swallowing his own voice. Word had already reached the general store by midday, and when he went in for feed sacks, the clerk's wife, a sharp-tongued woman named Della Ruth, made a show of stepping back from the counter as if his shadow carried something contagious. "Didn't know we were letting Indian kin shop in town now," she said, loud enough for the whole store to hear. And the 2 ranchers by the door laughed the way men laugh when they want someone else to feel small. Ezra paid for his feed without lifting his eyes and walked out into the sun, feeling smaller than he had in years. And it would have been easy, so easy, to let that shame decide things for him. To never ride toward that valley again and let the chief's story stay a rumor that faded by winter. But that night, turning Nachi's wooden horse over in his hands, he understood that the smallness the town wanted him to feel was exactly the kind of smallness that had let him live 30 years without once being carried by anyone, and he was done choosing that. Even the preacher took a turn at it, come Sunday service, working a line into his sermon about the dangers of consorting with those outside the fold, that everyone in the pews understood was aimed squarely at the young ranch hand sitting alone in the back row. Ezra sat through it without flinching, staring at his own hands, thinking that not one person in that church had ever ridden 3 miles out of their way to save a stranger's life the way Nachi had. And yet it was Nachi's name being spoken like a warning. The only person in Widow's Bend who didn't look at Ezra differently was an old hand named Merle Watkins, half-deaf and twice Ezra's age, who'd spent 30 years being talked over by younger men and had long since stopped caring what anyone in that town thought about anything. He found Ezra mending fence that evening and said, without much ceremony, that a man ought to go find out the truth of his own life, even if it cost him a job mucking another man's stalls. "Jobs come and go," Merle said, spitting into the dirt. "Family don't ride into town twice." But when Chief Tosca returned that afternoon, alone this time, riding slow past the saloon, where every eye in town tracked his path, Ezra found his boots carrying him out to the road before Grum could stop him The chief reined in beside him without dismounting, studying Ezra's face like he was reading a page he'd been waiting years to finish. "His name was Nachi," the chief said finally. "My only son. 3 winters ago he went out after a storm to check the canyon trail, and he came back speaking of a white boy the river nearly took. He would not stop speaking of you. Not that week. Not any week after." Ezra's chest went tight. He asked the question he was afraid to ask. Where was Nachi now? Why had he never come back to say his own name? And the chief's face closed like a door being shut against winter. "Come to our camp at first light," was all he said, "and I will answer what a street is not fit to hear." Then he rode on, leaving Ezra standing in the open with Grum watching from the porch, arms crossed, jaw set like a man already deciding how to punish him for it. Ezra almost didn't go back out to meet the chief a second time. He stood at the corral fence for a long while that afternoon, watching the road, telling himself that a wage and a bunk were more than an orphan had any right to expect, and that chasing a dead man's story could cost him the only stability he'd ever managed to build. But then he thought of the wooden horse, worn smooth by another man's thumb, and understood that stability built on forgetting who had saved his life wasn't really stability at all. It was just another kind of hiding. Grum didn't wait until morning. He crossed the yard that same evening, boots kicking up dust, and told Ezra plainly that if he rode out to that camp at first light, there'd be no job waiting when he rode back. Not tomorrow, not ever. "You've got nothing out there but a dead man's ghost," Grum said. "You've got a wage right here." Ezra looked at the man who'd fed him for 2 winters and paid him honestly enough, and felt for the first time no fear at the thought of losing what Grum offered. He didn't sleep that night either. He lay in the bunkhouse listening to the other hands snore, running his thumb over the wooden horse until its edges felt like the only solid thing left in a world that had shifted under him twice in 2 days. When the sky finally began to grey, he saddled his horse in the dark by feel alone, quiet enough not to wake Grum, and rode out past the corral fence without looking back at the ranch that had been the only home he'd known for 2 winters. Ezra rode out before sunrise, half certain Grum would for him for it, and not caring any more. The Apache camp sat in a shallow valley ringed with cottonwoods, smoke rising thin and quiet from a dozen fires, dogs stirring lazily as his horse passed between the lodges. Chief Tosca was waiting for him alone at the edge of camp, seated on a blanket spread over the cold ground, and he gestured for Ezra to sit across from him, the way Nachi once had, beside a different fire, 3 winters and 1 lifetime ago. 2 winters after the flood, the chief began, raiders came for our horses in the night. Nachi rode out to turn them from the herd alone, because he said a friend's debt was worth more than his own safety. His voice did not break, but his hands, folded in his lap, tightened until the knuckles paled. He did not come back from that ride. We found him at sunrise 3 miles from camp, and beside him, tracks leading toward your ranch. As if even wounded, his last thought was making sure the fight never reached you. Chief Tosca described it slowly, as though each detail cost him something to hand over. The raiders scattering the herd toward the canyon rim, Nachi alone against 3 riders in the dark, choosing the narrow trail that led away from camp instead of the wide one that would have brought him help faster, because the narrow trail was the one that passed nearest Ezra's ranch. He did not think of it as brave, the chief said. He thought of it as simple. A debt is a debt, even one the other man does not know he is owed. Ezra could not speak. The wooden horse in his coat pocket suddenly felt heavier than any tool he'd carried in his life. He thought of every quiet, unremarkable day he'd spent mucking stalls for Grum's coins, never once knowing a man he'd never properly met had bled out in the dark, keeping trouble away from his door. "Why didn't you come sooner?" Ezra finally managed, voice raw. "Why now? After 3 years?" Chief Tosca was quiet for a long moment before answering, his eyes fixed somewhere past Ezra on the smoke rising from the nearest fire. "Because grief needed 3 years to become something other than anger," he said finally. "And because before he died, Nachi asked one thing of me, that if his debt was ever repaid by seeing you safe and grown into a good man, I should give you what was his, not out of pity, out of family." He unwrapped a bundle beside him, Nachi's hunting knife, a worn saddle blanket, and the deed markers to a small parcel of grazing land bordering the valley. Land the tribe no longer needed to work. "A man is not measured by what he owns," the chief said quietly, echoing words Ezra had carried for 3 years without knowing their source. "He is measured by what he carries for someone else. My son carried you. Now it is time someone carries you again." Around them, a handful of tribe members had gathered at a respectful distance, watching without judgment, and one older woman stepped forward and set a warm blanket across Ezra's shoulders without a word, the way you'd tend to any grieving member of your own family. No one in Widow's Bend had ever touched him with that kind of gentleness, and it undid him more completely than the chief's story had. Ezra wept without shame for the first time since he was 11 years old, right there on the cold ground of a camp that had just called him family. When he rode back into Widow's Bend that afternoon, Grum was waiting on the porch with his arms crossed and his final ultimatum ready. "Well," Grum demanded, "ranch or ghosts, boy? Pick one before supper." Ezra dismounted slowly, the bundle of Nachi's belongings tied behind his saddle, and for a moment he simply let the silence sit between them the way Chief Tosca always did before speaking a hard truth. "I pick the family that came looking for me," Ezra said finally, "over the one that only ever paid me by the day." Grum's face went through anger, then confusion, then something almost like respect he'd never admit to feeling. He didn't say another word. He just turned and went back inside, and Ezra understood the job, and the 30 cents a day were already gone, and that for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like he'd lost anything at all. By the following spring, Ezra Doyle no longer worked another man's cattle for 30 cents a day. On the small parcel of grazing land Chief Tosca had given him, he'd built a modest cabin with his own hands, and every morning he rode the fence line on a young mare he'd named simply Nachi's Girl. The Apache camp in the valley was no longer a place he visited in secret shame. It was a place he was welcomed, a second family that had claimed him the same way his own blood never had the chance to. Widow's Bend changed slowly around him, the way most towns do, not with apologies, but with small shifts nobody announced out loud. Della Ruth nodded to him now when he came in for supplies, quiet and a little ashamed, and never again made a show of stepping back from the counter. Old Merle Watkins rode out most Sundays to sit on Ezra's porch and share coffee, telling anyone who'd listen that he'd known all along the boy had more family waiting on him than the town ever gave him credit for. Some evenings when the work was done and the light turned gold over the grazing land Nachi's death had made possible, Ezra would ride up to a quiet bend in the canyon trail, the same stretch where a flood had once nearly taken his life, and simply sit there a while, the way another man might visit a grave he'd never been given the chance to find sooner. It was as close to a resting place as Nachi had, and Ezra made sure it was never forgotten. He kept the small carved wooden horse on the windowsill of his cabin, facing the valley where Nachi had once sat him by a fire and spoken words that would carry him through 3 lonely years without a name to hang them on. A man is not measured by what he owns. He is measured by what he carries for someone else. Ezra understood now that Nachi had carried him long before that flood, and long after his own life had ended, and that carrying it forward, for anyone who needed it, was the only inheritance worth having. He thought, too, of all the years he'd measured himself by what he lacked. No parents, no name worth repeating, no land, no place at any table that was truly his. And how strange it was that the richest thing he'd ever been given had come from a father mourning a son, handed to him not because Ezra had earned it, but simply because he had once been worth carrying. If a stranger had once carried your safety on his own back without ever asking for a name in return, would you have the courage, years later,